We recently put out these 2 episodes centered around endurance for CrossFit. And for our next stop down this rabbit hole, we visit Providence, Rhode Island and interview former TTT coach and exercise physiologist, Evan Peikon. And when Evan is not listening to hardcore metal music, he's just casually figuring out how to non-intrusively measure nitric oxide. So hopefully he can shed some light on our subject. What did I do? I parked at the airport.
The Atlanta airport.
Huh?
The Atlanta airport.
The Atlanta airport, and I had to pee soon, probably somewhere on the highway. And I was like, I had a little water bottle in my passenger seat, and I was like, should I pee in this? No, have some dignity, Chris. Actually, it was just because it wasn't like a Gatorade. It was like a thin drop, and I was like worried about. I was like, my aim's not that good. So anyway, I go through the airport, and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna get there. And then there's this huge baggage. I had to check the bag with all the podcast gear, and there's a huge line. I was like, oh. And then so I'm texting Kyle, and I got there 2 hours early, by the way. And I'm texting Kyle, and I'm like, oh, man. And then finally get through that, and then the security check. And it was like forever. And then long story short, folks, I'm running through the airport. I missed the gate. As soon as I get there, I'm huffing and puffing, blowing the house down, wearing my Crocs. Shout out Crocs, sponsor me. And I get to the gate, and the lady closes the door and says, sorry, you missed it. And I was like, oh. And then I'm just sitting there watching the plane sit there for how long was it, Kyle? How long did y'all sit there while I was already there?
So you sent me a picture of our airplane from when you were standing at the gate. And from that time until we backed out was at least 20 minutes. So Chris just basically was outside with them not letting him onto the airplane for 20 minutes.
And I noticed just now that we made a crucial error.
What's that?
This whole time, I'm trying to fly to Rhode Island because we got Evan Peikon, our main man from back in the Dizzy.
Mm-hmm. Hello, Evan.
So that's where we were trying to get to. Hi, Evan.
Hey, Chris.
Wave to the crowd. But we did it. We rebooked. We got here. And now I'm just like, man, this is the first time I've had to set up the podcast gear on the fly. And I'm hoping we're not forgetting anything.
I think you got it, Chris.
We've set the stage. My endurance was amazing to get to that airport, Kyle. Can you tell me what Zone 2 had an impact on me not making that flight?
While Evan and I are having this conversation, I want you to use that Apple Watch and go back and see your heart rate, what heart rate zone you're in during your trip through the airport.
Yeah,
the problem. You know the
I think
mistake.
you have to turn it on.
You know the mistake you made?
No.
You arrived at the Atlanta airport 2 hours early instead of 3. Just saying.
Well, I think the even bigger mistake is that he's trying to use heart rate to gauge where his zone 2 is.
Oh no. Is that the beginning of this conversation? All right, Evan.
Yeah, so let's go there. You've listened to our past 2 episodes, right?
I have.
All right. And I don't know any of your thoughts yet. Y'all apparently talked about it in the car on the way to pick me up, right?
Yep.
Ooh, this is going to be spicy. Let's go.
All right, I'm going to bite. So what's the problem with using heart rate to regulate endurance training intensity? Why is that an issue?
So let's take a step back from there. Why even do zone 2 training in the first place? What are you trying to get from it?
Endurance training. No, I'm kidding.
All right. Really, Kyle, that's where we're going to start?
Yeah, we're going to go that deep.
Well, when people are doing zone 2 training, generally what they're trying to do is create cardiovascular adaptations and improve their cardiac output. Why are they trying to do that? Well, because they think that that's a primary limiter for performance. I don't even think that is a true statement. So I think the fundamental assumptions that people are basing the need to do zone 2 training on are wrong. Hypothetically, though, even if they weren't, I don't think zone 2 training is necessarily the most effective way to even improve cardiac output in the first place.
All right. So already, if someone's listening to that, they're like, all right, who's this motherfucker and why is he shooting down my dreams? So make him not hate you.
All right. So Brandon and I spent 2 podcasts talking about how I added some zone 2 work to my training, and it definitely helped. Like there were tangible benefits.
But what else are you doing? Because I know for a fact you're not only doing zone 2 training. So I think the mistake isn't doing zone 2. There's nothing wrong with that. Zone 2 is great. It's probably beneficial to do it in some capacity. I think it's that people grossly overemphasize that it's going through a hype cycle right now where it's the cool thing. Everyone's creating content about it. So people are overemphasizing the importance. So the way that I would explain it is that zone 2 is necessary if you want to improve your endurance. That's a fair statement, but it's definitely not sufficient. So if you're only going and doing a bunch of zone 2, unless you're a beginner athlete, it's not going to be a lot of bang for your buck. It would be like if you told me, I want to improve my 1 rep max back squat, and every day I go in and I do leg extensions. Like, okay, cool, that's probably fine. Are you back squatting? Oh no, I don't do that. Well, why wouldn't you be doing the thing that you're trying to improve? So for zone 2 training, that is the equivalent of leg extensions for your cardiovascular system. It is the assistance training. If you're not doing something that is more stimulative and developmental, you could do all the zone 2 in the world, but it's not going to be the thing that actually transfers over and improves your performance.
So it's not that you're saying that zone 2 is bad training in any way.
No. I'm coming in, caught us being a little hyperbolic intentionally just to, shake things up a bit. But no, I don't think it's bad. It's definitely not going to be detrimental unless, you're doing so much that you can't recover from your other kind of training.
YouTube thumbnail title?
YouTube thumbnail title.
You're poking the bear?
Zone 2, more like number 2.
Oh, snap. That was pretty good.
There you go.
That's about PG, second grade level.
So I know this is something you and I have talked about for years at this point. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you've always said that you're not dismissive of heart rate training.
No.
Right? Of heart rate zones. But you've always said that one of the biggest issues is that heart rate zones don't tell you that much about what's going on inside your body, why your heart rate is where it is. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit before we tie into, because where I want to go is talk about how some of the zones are miscalculated and things like that. But
Yeah, so starting with that, we'll work backward. One, I don't think there's anything wrong with heart rate training. I think it's really useful. It's easy to use, most importantly. At the end of the day, the technology is not easy to use and it's not simple. It's not really that worthwhile. And I think in that regard, heart rate's awesome. Anyone could use it. Anyone could benefit. I think generally people misuse it in a lot of ways, like not calculating or not actually finding your maximal heart rate and then generating zones based on some arbitrary number. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
So that would be like someone using an age predicted max versus determining their actual heart rate max. For example,
when I was running a low 4-minute mile, my maximal heart rate was 167 beats per minute. I was 18 years old. My max heart rate should have been like 220 beats per minute or something to that effect.
I think based on the age predicted formula, it would have been 202.
So what should have been my zone 2 is actually effectively my max heart rate. So even there, you could understand that, heart rate is useful, but you need to do the legwork to make sure you're actually using it properly. But beyond that, well, why do we care about heart rate in the first place? What we want to know is how much blood flow and oxygen we're getting to tissues. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that if they, use heart rate training. But my argument is that that's not really what's governing blood flow and oxygen delivery to tissues. So when you consider, even look at the mathematical formulas for how you calculate blood volume, the denominator in those formulas is radius to the 4th power. That's blood vessel radius. Your cardiac output could increase about 20-fold from rest, us sitting here right now, to maximal effort exercise. 20-fold sounds like a lot, but when you consider that your vessel wall changing diameter is taken to the 4th power, every tiny little change in the radius of your blood vessels has a humongous change on blood flow. Effectively, the smallest changes in your blood vessel diameter effectively wash out even the difference between rest and maximal cardiac output. So are you telling me that being at 120 versus 180 beats per minute is really changing your blood flow that much? No, I don't think that's the case.
Then why do people use heart rate? Like if it doesn't really mean anything, why is it so pervasive in training? Why is it something that, when I was, coming up through graduate school, we used heart rate. We talked about heart rate zones and lactate threshold and the heart rates that connected to that. Why is it so pervasive at this point? And is that a problem?
It's the best thing that people had at the time, legitimately.
That was going to be my guess because they could measure it.
Because they can measure it. Yeah, exactly.
Pick me.
Because they could measure it. Techniques to measure oxy and deoxyhemoglobin with near-infrared light were invented about 15 or so years after. And those pieces of equipment were humongous. We're talking like 1990s Microsoft PC computer size pieces of equipment with wires running off of them. Really wasn't until about, let's say, 10 to 12 years ago that it shrunk down from PC size to like roughly little, like a half a Game Boy Color size or like a little Game Boy Color cartridge size. And at that point, heart rate monitoring is a huge industry. So there's that inertia to fight. There's also this thing, near-infrared spectroscopy, crazy sounding name, hard to pronounce. Nobody knows what that is. The devices were not very user-friendly. So even if you did know that you could buy this tiny device and put it on your body, you're going to pay over $1,000 for it. That versus $50 heart rate monitor, not that easy.
And this is an easy selling point too, right? Like I was actually just thinking about how many heart rate monitors we have in the room. So I've got, the Whoop on one, I've got my Garmin, you've got the Apple Watch and the Oura Ring, and then Chris has got his Apple Watch. So we've got a whole bunch of heart rate monitors sitting in here. So it's like everyone has access to it. And it's always been something that everyone has just kind of gravitated towards. And it's been sold to us as like, one of the heart rate training is always sold as an upgrade to like, talk test or nose breathing.
The thing is, right now you think of heart rate monitoring and you think simple, easy to use, but that's not what heart rate monitoring was. In the 80s, when it was first coming to prominence, people said no one is ever going to use that aside from Olympic caliber athletes. That's impossible. That's for medical doctors. Now, I mean, with the Apple Watch, millions of people measuring their heart rate on a continuous basis, so we think it's simple. Infrared spectroscopy or NIRS is the same thing. So the reason why it was so hard to use about 10 to 12 years ago is that those pieces of equipment came out of academia. I mean, even like you look at something like bioinformatics or computational biology, and you look at their like user interface and user experience in their software, it's light years behind what you have in your mobile phone on a daily basis. And it's not because the people working in academia are stupid and they can't figure out how to make good user interfaces. They don't have the time or effort to do that. And the people that are good at making clean user interfaces, they go and work for Meta or Google or Amazon. They're not going to go work for some random academic lab for $45,000 a year. So I think a lot of it is just like the inertia of heart rate monitoring, some of these new technologies being really hard to use when they come onto market.
I mean, that was one of the things that prevented me from using it. And you introduced me to the Moxie in like 2017, around 2017.
Have we said what it measures yet on here?
No.
Let's do that. The NIRS device, what does it measure?
So standard NIRS devices, really what they present you is your muscle oxygen saturation. So if you've heard Apple Watch or a Whoop or Oura Ring, they talk about your blood oxygen saturation. That is the amount of oxygen in your arteries. Muscle oxygen saturation is in the muscle tissue. So if you use an Apple Watch, you measure your blood oxygenation, you'll see it somewhere around 97% right now. It tends to not move too much.
I'll tell you as you're talking.
Okay. Muscle oxygen saturation tends to be much lower. So if I'm measuring my blood oxygenation, I'm flexing my arm right now, nothing's happening. If I put a NIRS device on my forearm and I'm flexing my forearm, you're going to see oxygen being consumed with each contraction. And as I release, you're going to see reoxygenation. So it's a measurement that tracks with exercise intensity in the same way that heart rate does effectively. It's a similar idea.
Well, I think one of the challenges to adoption of something like a NIRS device has always been interpreting the information. I mean, I tried the Human when, Human was a thing.
Yeah.
You have given all these presentations on Moxie, and I still feel like I would have a really hard time interpreting the information that comes out of it. I mean, isn't that one of the biggest hurdles to adoption of some of the newer, and I say newer, it's not that new.
Yeah, those aren't even new at this point, but yeah, that's a big hurdle. I mean, frankly, if I were to use one of those technologies right now and put an athlete through an assessment, it's still going to be quite some effort on my ends to interpret that data and provide insight. I might spend an hour, 2 hours going through that. And at the end of the day, knowing what I know now, I think they even provide an incomplete picture, just giving muscle oxygenation in the absence of a measurement that tells you something like blood flow. It's one side of the picture. You can't really interpret that in absence of the blood flow component.
So can I pause you real quick? Yeah. We started this little rabbit hole because we said, why did heart rate take off? And we said it was because it was something you could measure. What were we talking about when we got on that thread? Do you remember?
Yeah, so we were talking about zone 2. I don't remember how we got off on the
how
heart
can we
rate
tie
rabbit
that
hole.
back
So yeah, I think what
everybody?
we were trying to get to is why are you doing zone 2 training? So we were saying, well, most people are thinking improve blood flow and oxygenation to tissues. But my point is that improving your cardiac output isn't the best way to do that. So knowing what we are saying, that it's radius to the 4th power, what you want to do is improve your ability to dilate blood vessels. You could do that. Then you could improve your cardiac output. But cardiac output is secondary. You could have the best cardiac output in the world, but if you can't dilate the blood vessels in your working muscles, it doesn't matter. Your brain's not going to let you increase your cardiac output. It will actually prevent your heart from increasing it to protect yourself from increasing your blood pressure too high.
Just curious, do you have any analogies you use to explain that?
He's always offhand? So good at
that. Yeah.
Don't put him on the spot now.
No.
Yeah, so you could think of it 2 ways. So one, let's think of the exercising muscle like the faucet in your house. And all of the pipes that go to your faucet are the arteries and arterioles and capillaries, and then your heart is your water pump. So it could go two ways. One, what would happen if you made all of the pipes in your house 20% bigger and then you tried to turn all your faucets on? You're going to have low water pressure. At some point, your heart the water pump can't pump enough to keep the water pressure stable. Heart works the same way. You could only dilate blood vessels in so many regions of your body before your blood pressure would drop. Your brain's not going to let you do that. In the same way, imagine you shrunk all the pipes in your house down now and you turned all your faucets on all the way. Your pipes are going to explode because they're constricted. It's what happens in the winter when you don't turn off your faucets outside. Too much liquid is in the pipes. It expands, pipes burst. The analogy in your body would be your cardiac output is increasing and you're not dilating your blood vessels. Your arterial blood pressure would get so high that you would burst your arteries.
So going back to what you were saying, we should be more focused on
improving your ability to dilate blood vessels. Because at the end of the day, you could train your ability to increase cardiac output all you want, but if you can't dilate your blood vessels, your brain's never going to let you increase your cardiac output in the first place. It's a dead end.
And you're saying that zone 2 is not the most effective way to do that?
No, absolutely not. And the reason...
Is it zone 3?
No. So how do you...
Absolutely. It's just zone 3. You just add one to it.
Here's what I want to know. How do you know that zone 2 is not the most effective way to promote blood flow to the working tissues?
Okay. So when you utilize oxygen in a working muscle, there's a compensatory response. So let's say each unit of oxygen you utilize, there's an increase in blood flow.
Okay.
So we're together. That's called autoregulation of blood flow. I mean, this is discovered, I think, in around the 1920s. This is Arthur Guyton. So if you utilize oxygen, your oxygen saturation in your muscles is coming down. You're getting more and more blood flow. But if you're at the same pace, eventually it's going to level off. So you might just hover at a moderate oxygenation level. No more blood flow above baseline there. You're just going to stay at the same amount of blood flow.
So there's an initial, like doing zone 2, there's an initial increase in blood flow to the working tissues. But once you reach sort of a steady state, which is what everyone's trying to do when they're doing zone 2, they're trying to reach that steady state that they can hold for a long time. Once you reach steady state, there's no further increase in blood flow.
Not above the threshold that you get to. So if you really wanted to go after those adaptations that people are trying to go after, you would use something that we kind of stumbled into, 5 years ago, the gradual repeat desaturation intervals, where you gradually increase pace across an interval from a very, very easy pace up to what would probably be the equivalent of like a EN5 or a zone 4 in most people's models.
Yeah.
And then once you reach there, you just kind of like tap it, then you stop and you rest and you let your tissues resaturate and you repeat that over and over.
An example of that using heart rate zones would be something like 5 minutes in zone 1, 4 minutes in zone 2, 3 minutes in zone 3.
Yeah, and kind of like a spectrum. So most people are familiar with like a tempo run that a endurance athlete would do. Imagine taking a 30-minute tempo run and compressing that down into about a 2 to 5 minute interval and doing that over and over. Now, this is where when we're talking about zone 2, I think a lot of the improvements that people get in their performance when they do it is not from improving their cardiac output or blood flow. I think it's efficiency. So this is where I don't think we should just say, never do zone 2 again. I think there's absolutely a place for it. But I think the reason why people get fitter is not because it's creating these physiologic adaptations per se, unless someone's just really never done that type of training.
So to that point, do you think it's really critical that if someone is going to do zone 2, because like you said, it's not bad. If someone's going to add zone 2 training, that they need to be they need to take into consideration what modality they do so that they are improving efficiency in the modality that matters to them.
Exactly. With the caveat that becomes so challenging in CrossFit because most people cannot stay at that low level intensity while doing sport specific movements. Like you're not going to do a zone 2 wall ball session.
We talked about that in the
that's
Q&A
why I
podcast.
tied in for that same reason. So that's where in CrossFit it becomes difficult because you could row, you could run, you could assault bike. And I think that's going to have some efficacy, but to the extent that those are used in competition events. So if someone is like an open level athlete, I would primarily do their zone 2 on the rower, knowing that they're not going to be running or assault biking in the open unless I'm out of the loop enough that is actually incorporated at this point.
Well, it depends if you count shuttle running as...
Okay, yeah. I mean, so maybe that does become more useful. I didn't know shuttle runnings have been included recently, but...
If you were a master's athlete, they were included in every stage of the qualifying process. Still not happy about that.
Yeah, I know you're not. I still remember my first time being at Training Think Tank for the Opens. Kyle knows exactly where this is going.
Yep.
2016 Opens, coaching Kyle or judging Kyle. And it was the workout with the overhead walking lunges and burpees and I think toes to bar.
16.1.
And I don't know what I did wrong. I think I was telling you how much time you had left or something. And Kyle like allegedly just looked at me like he wanted to like grind my arm into a nub and he went, and I'm like, I don't know what you're saying. And Max was looking at me and we're both just like, I have no idea what's going on. And you were just yelling at me in some kind of like animalistic.
Well, I have a problem when I exercise, and I think that it's that all the blood flow to my brain is cut off while I'm exercising. There's probably a mechanism that you could explain for why I go from, I don't know if I'm not going to say that I'm like the most intelligent person, but I go from at least I can have a conversation with somebody to I am like, I can't count. I'm a babbling idiot in the middle of a workout.
Yeah. That's actually real.
What's the mechanism for that?
When you go from, blood flow and oxygen delivery to your brain and muscles are a very different system. When you exercise, the harder you work, generally the more oxygen you're going to use in your muscles and the more your oxygen saturation will go down. In the brain, you actually have kind of a different response. It looks more like a bell curve, which is interesting. So as you go from low intensity exercise to higher intensity, you increase oxygen consumption in your brain, but there's an overshoot that you get even more blood flow than you need. So your oxygen saturation actually goes up as your oxygen consumption is increasing. But if you push past a certain threshold, your oxygen utilization supersedes your supply and your brain oxygenation starts going down. And that's when your decision-making gets really crappy. So that's why people do really unintelligent things when they're at altitude, like decide to take their down jacket off and roll around in the snow or take their tether off. Yeah.
We were talking about the book we both have read, Into Thin Air, which is about climbing Mount Everest. And some of the things that people do if they run out of oxygen are they're just insane.
Yeah. And even
so if I do something stupid, I should be like, sorry, I was just working out too hard.
I was just working out too hard. And I mean, that's a thing in marathoning. So it's been studied that it's called neurovascular coupling. For whatever reason, whatever genetic, I want to say abnormality, genetic advantage that a specific tribe of Kenyan runners tend to have better neurovascular coupling, so better blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. So their decision-making is less impaired under high fatigue in marathons compared to other populations that have been studied where sometimes you're watching them and you're like, why did they decide to do that? Like, that wasn't a very good move.
Yeah, it's like the opposite. Mine's probably blunted as exercise intensity increases.
All right. So Evan, like I said, you listen to the other couple podcasts. From those two, if we're saying that, hey, zone 2 might not be the full picture, and I know that they even said that there's like a hierarchy of needs and that it's not where they think most people should start. What do you think you could provide our audience who, they're clicking on these things because they're obviously interested in improving their endurance. Yeah. So with that caveat, and if you haven't listened to the other episodes about, there's a hierarchy to this. If you're in CrossFit, it might not be your ideal thing. With that out of the way, how could you help them? What should they focus on if they want to improve their endurance?
Yeah, totally. So when someone's asking these questions about zone 2, presumably it's because they want to get better at CrossFit, right? So the question is conditioning the limiter for them? So the way that I would think about it is, zoom way back first. Let's say you have your sport-specific capacities, so we could lump in like, are you strong enough? Are you good enough technically, tactically? Could you do muscle-ups? All these different things. So that's one ceiling. And we could say, just really simply, what is your VO2 max? I know VO2 max isn't perfect, but go with me here. So we could consider it the maximal integrated capacity
and for people who don't know, what is VO2 max?
Yeah, so VO2 to start is just how much oxygen could your body consume. VO2 max is the highest VO2 value you could achieve. What is the most amount of oxygen you could consume relative to your body weight?
Why is that interesting to people?
So the reason it's interesting is you could think of VO2 max as a maximum integrated capacity of your pulmonary system, so your respiratory system, your cardiovascular system, and your muscular system to uptake, transport, and utilize oxygen. So the higher your VO2 max, essentially the bigger your engine. People always talk about engine in CrossFit. So let's say conditioning is just getting your VO2 max higher. I know that's a gross oversimplification, but work with me here. So we have these two ceilings. So let's say VO2 max is here and your sport specific capacities are here. You're that athlete that comes to TTT and you are amazing at doing open workouts. But when we start looking at your cyclical measurements, we're like, you have a 7-minute, 10-second 2K and you did that well in the open? Like it almost doesn't even make sense, but they're so good. They've like milked every bit that they can out of the sport skills. So for them, we're like, got to close that gap because you could only perform as well as your lower ceiling. So for them, they need to improve their conditioning.
Yeah, as soon as the wall ball row workout pops up,
where do we want their 2K to be?
They're in trouble.
So yeah, I'll come back to that in a second. So let's flip flop that now. So we have the athlete that comes to TTT and they're like an ex-triathlete and they have like a 625 2K, but they snatch 140 pounds. And you're like, your conditioning is so good. Your VO2 max is so high, but your sport specific capacities.
This is the Brooks Merkel.
So we got a guy at the gym. Yeah.
It's one of my clients. Time.
Yeah. Okay. So that lower ceiling, the sport specific one is so low that it's like, they just need to close the gap that way. And some people are more balanced. So which of those two people are you? If you're that person that is amazing at the sport, yeah, really go all in on improving your conditioning, assuming you could maintain those other qualities, limiter bridge performance model. But if you're that person that has amazing conditioning, and I found a lot of times the people that are asking these questions and are really in the weeds about zone 2 and this and that are people that come from endurance sport backgrounds. They're kind of like in on the zeitgeist and they want to do all the new innovative things. And it's like, for you, it just doesn't matter. Like we could get you from a 625 2K to a 555 and get you on the US Olympic team and you're not going to be any better at CrossFit.
So what about the person who's in the middle of those two things though, where they're like good at all of it?
That is the hardest person to coach because at the end of the day, how much volume could you handle? Like obviously you could prioritize things and maintain other things. I always recommend a lot of times people in that situation, they're like, should I do a strength cycle and get really strong or should I do a conditioning cycle? And the answer is probably neither. It's that maybe you should tune down the volume on one of those things and tune up the volume on the other. So you're maintaining and building, and then you could maintain the one that you just built and kind of flip flop back and forth. That way you're not spending months improving one thing and letting everything else regress.
Because if you do that, then you become an unbalanced athlete. And then you've got to spend all that time bringing up the thing that you left behind.
Situations are always kind of like sad when you see people do that because you know they're working so hard to improve on something and they do improve that thing, but they get worse at the sport. And that's kind of tragic. So I think first, to Chris's point, figure out who you are. Where in that, prioritization scheme are you? If you are really that person that needs to improve conditioning, now we get even more specific. Are you bad at conditioning or do you have a low VO2 max because your cardiovascular system is lagging? Delivery limited athlete? Are you an athlete with a utilization limitation, more of a local muscle limitation? And then depending on which of those people you are, that determines if you are that delivery limited athlete. Zone 2 totally fits within your training scheme. You just need to find out where in that.
And what's the best way without them for the person who doesn't have a coach to figure that out?
Yeah, so we could use some heuristics. So think of the athlete that kind of similar to strength training where you look at their 1 rep max and then you look at their 2 rep max and their 5 rep max and their 10 and you're like, they're all basically the same number. You're like, wait, your 1 rep max back squat's 300 pounds and your 10 rep max is like 297.5. That person's probably utilization limited. They're the same athlete.
Utilization, I don't think we've said it on this podcast.
Yeah. So it's your maximal rate that you could consume oxygen in your muscles. So that's the person that oftentimes they'll come from an endurance sport background and you're like, okay, your half marathon time, your 10K, your 5K, your mile are all at the same pace. It's that one gear athlete that can't pick it up, probably limited by their ability to utilize the oxygen in the muscle. For that person, repeat sprint protocols are going to be great. Heavy strength training, increasing the amount of mitochondria so they could consume oxygen in the tissues. Amazing. All of those things, EN5 training, EN7 training in TTT's model, not zone 2 for that person.
So that was one heuristic you said, is if you're that person. Anything else for that style of person? Know?
So for that style of person, they're almost the easiest one to help because they've probably polarized their training so much that they've done so much volume of such low intensity training that they just need intensity, a potent stimulus. Generally, they're going to need higher volumes than most people. So traditionally, we might say like 5x5 back squat at 85% of 1 rep max. It might be like 10 sets of 5 back squat at 90% of 1 rep max.
I was going to say, these are the type of athletes that you and I started experimenting with really high volume, auto-regulated, high percentage strength training.
Yeah. And a lot of that auto-regulation, it was like, almost a lack of confidence on our part at the time, because the things that we were finding worked for those athletes just seems so insane. It would be like 15 sets of 5 at 90%. I would never think to prescribe that. I'm going to blow out people's ACLs. For the people that need it, though, it works. So what we did auto-regulating, it was kind of like a safety mechanism that if you're not the person that needs that, you'll never end up doing that much volume. You won't hurt yourself.
And the auto-regulation is almost also a test where it would be like, do as many sets of 5 at 90% as possible, capped at 15. I'd usually cap it at 10.
I would cap it too, the first time.
And, you know, when you fail a set, like that's where we know where an effective, at least an effective dose would be to failure. And then we would scale back from there.
So that's one of those kind of avatars. And if you want an example of what they would tend to look like, this guy. On the opposite end of the spectrum, it's almost convenient that here is the Kyle Ruth, the delivery limited athlete, someone who, you know, you look at their 1 rep max and their 10 rep max and you're like, that is a huge gap. Or when they're working to a 1 rep max, they're like, oh, that's it. I can't go any heavier. And you're like, your bar speed was so quick, but there's no such thing as grinded reps. And if you look at their half marathon, well, they probably wouldn't be running half marathons.
To be clear, never run a half marathon, but I am doing this 12-mile ruck. So I will be going close to it.
If you're looking at like the 1K time versus the 2K, it tends to be such a big gap in pace, is like a really sharp fall off.
For me, it was really the big fall off. It was 2K to 5K. So like 500, like 118, and then like 257 for a 1K. And then I think my lifetime best was around 634 for a 2K. And then I can't hold sub 150 pace for a 5K. And my 30-minute time trial, my best after really training it was a 154. Like it was a huge fall off.
Yeah. And I remember for a long time, I was the opposite, where I remember the first time I did the 30-minute time trial at TTT, I was somewhere in like the high 140s. And I remember, I think it might've been Adam at the time. He was like, man, like, what's your 2K? And I told him my 2K pace, and it was basically what I did for the half-hour time trial. He was like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I just can't go any faster. Shortly after, Adam made me verse him in a 30-minute ski erg time trial, and I had never ski erged before. And I thought I had severe rhabdo for a week too. So that's another fun fact.
Well, you're also the person who injured their pec deadlifting.
I was deadlifting, to be fair.
Let's get it back on track, boys. All right. So you were given those 2 examples.
Yeah.
And the reason we were given those examples is because you were going to...
Yeah. So basically explaining, are you the person that needs zone 2? So if conditioning is the limiter for you, you may be that person. And then sub-segmenting even further, are you that person that has that really sharp fall off in paces? If so, zone 2 should probably be part of your training. So, I mean, out of the people asking these detailed questions about zone 2, knowing how like different everyone that comes to TTT is, you think maybe 20 to 30% of people would actually benefit from it. So what I'm always trying to get across to people that are asking these great training questions, and obviously they care a lot if they're looking these things up and spending their time, is to figure out what you need first. So you could kind of cut through the noise and focus on the things that matter for you and not get paralysis by analysis, worry about all these other things. Because I've definitely been that person where you spend like 8 hours reading about different training methods and things like that aren't relevant for you. So I think that's, you know, my foundation is always figure out who you are, what do you need, do these things matter for you? And if they do, now we could get into the nuances of how do you program zone 2 versus the blended energy system protocols we talked about before, like KRI intervals or you name it. You know?
So here's a question for you. What is sometimes people come up with these questions because like we said, it's popular right now. So if someone was to come up to you and ask you about zone 2 and you had just given the explanation that, hey, you might need it. Is there like a, hey, what's a better question this person should be asking? Like, do you have something like that in mind? Like, man, I wish they'd be asking this instead.
That's a hard one.
Well, I think the better question is what type of limiter, what type of athlete are you? Where do you struggle? That's the question that they have to ask first before you can even go into what type of training should I do. It's like if someone were to say, walk up to you and you didn't know me, and I said, what type of training should I do? I mean, you could make up some bullshit.
Yeah. And it's like asking someone like, do you like drop sets? You're like, I don't know, like for who and what context, like any kind of training.
But that stuff just sucks to hear on like a podcast.
Yeah, no, totally. And I mean, that's why it's such a popular thing. Like people want to know really simple things. People like simple stories. But I think at the end of the day, it's like, what do you like more, hearing simple stories or actually improving?
Well, I think there's something to be said here too, because for the average person, not the average TTT athlete, but for the average person, zone 2 training is probably broadly applicable from like a health perspective, right?
We're talking about the regular public.
Regular public.
Totally.
It's probably broadly applicable. And that's part of the reason that I think it's so popular, is because if you do take deconditioned people, probably the best place to start would be something like zone 2 versus trying to get them to start with like repeat desaturation intervals.
Well, I would say that in our, because we're CrossFit focused, I would say in our community, the reason it's so popping off right now is probably because Fraser's been talking a lot about it. Was it on Rogan he talked about it, or?
Yeah, but think about Fraser, right? So Evan went through those 2 kind of avatars, right? Like there's the.
No, I'm just giving context of why our community's like taking off with it.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, that's where you would say, if you were to say like out of the game's athletes, would Fraser be someone that I think would benefit from that? Yeah, totally. Comes from a strength sport background. He was a competitive weightlifter. That's probably great for him. Where if you were to say like
Sam Briggs.
Yeah, Sam Briggs, does she need that? No, probably not. So I mean, I think that's a big part of it. But yeah, to your point too, like general health, totally awesome. A lot of people talk about like this marathoner started incorporating more of it. Again, very different context. A sport that arguably efficiency is even more important than having a high VO2 max. I mean, the case studies on Paul Radcliffe have showed that without any doubt, it's a very different sport than CrossFit. So I think when we're trying to take these concepts from other sports and just plug and play them, I think that's something honestly that James Fitzgerald did really well when, competitive programming for CrossFit first started kicking off, is he would say you can't just take these protocols from Pelican courses or this or that and just have CrossFit athletes do them. He's like, you need to recontextualize them for the different demands of our sport. So, I mean, I think there's something to that concept for sure. And I think Max is someone that really pushed that very early on as well.
Well, it's very different trying to take protocols that are for defined known and defined sports, right? So like you referenced marathon, like that it's a 26-mile race, and an approximate duration, and that, it's a single modality. And so all of those knowns make it so that it's very clear that, you need to build efficiency and you're going to spend a majority or a good chunk of your time in zone 2, but in a sport that's not known, it's unknown and unknowable. And that's going to test a wide range of physiologies. It's not just, like we said, it's broadly applicable for the general population or for endurance athletes, but not as broadly applicable for a sport that really does span so many different things.
Yeah. And I mean, even to take like a really sport specific example, like remember when Rich Froning got his VO2 max tested? Like this is way back when he was dominating. And I mean, it was high, but it was nothing crazy. It was like 70 or something to that effect. I think your VO2 max was around there at some point. My VO2 max has been at that level at some point. I wasn't Rich Froning.
No, I've certainly never been an individual games athlete.
He had this inhuman VO2 max that made him so good? No, probably not. It's that he was extremely efficient in the sport-specific movements because he did so much volume. So even for me with a games level athlete, I'm like, yeah, zone 2 could be great, particularly at a games level where there are these endurance events. But I think the bigger differentiator is how efficient are you at the movements that you actually do in your sport. And so much of that is volume dependent. I mean, I think really at the games level, that's why your mechanical tolerance is one of the best predictors, because it's just like, how much could you do? For a marathoner to improve their efficiency year after year, think about how many hundreds of miles they're running. Has a CrossFit athlete spent even a fraction of that time on any movement in their sport? Probably not. Which makes me think they could definitely improve efficiency on every single movement that they do.
Well, to that point as well, you mentioned that it was CrossFit Games athletes that we keep hearing that benefit so much from doing like lower intensity volume. Yeah. And if you think about the types of training that people do, they do it on bikes mostly or running. And for CrossFit Games athletes, there's often long bikes or running tested at the CrossFit Games level. And so it makes sense that athletes that are successful at that level are spending time doing large volumes of low intensity work like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean, as you have pointed out and Brandon pointed out in some of the previous podcasts that we've done, that's the most effective way for anybody or everybody.
Well, so let's do this because now this is going to be almost 3 podcasts worth of being like, hey, we're really trying to signal to you guys that you need to figure out which camp you're in because we don't want you to waste your time. We're trying to help you not go down a rabbit hole that you might not need to go down. But let's say that you did find out that you were the person that needed zone 2. Now let's help those guys out because they clicked it, they're here, they want to know more, they want to know what someone like you might think. So let's go down that route. Like what do you recommend for them? Yes,
I mean, generally for that person, have a performance marker that you think is relevant to improving that. So maybe it's a 30-minute row for max distance, something to that effect. I know we have a lot of good data on that at TTT. So start with a modest amount of zone 2 please do not abandon the developmental work like gradual repeat desaturation intervals and EN3 training and just do extra zone 2. So keep the training that you're already doing, add some zone 2 in, maybe start with an hour, 2 hours a week for the average person, obviously a games athlete, because they could recover, they could do more, and see if you progress. I mean, I think a lot of training is like,
how do we see if we progress? What are we looking at?
So yeah, you would have that performance marker on that 30-minute row time trial. You could test these things. You could maybe do a shorter version of that because that's a pretty nasty event to do, but have something that you're tracking. Maybe even if you knew that a certain biomarker correlated with improved performance on there, so you don't need to do a really difficult test, have that. And if you progress, then you don't need to do more. If you don't progress, then you need to change something. I think so much of training is really using that process. It's not off the bat figuring out how do I perfectly hit every single variable. It's just adding something in, seeing if the change that you want happens. And if not, then make a change again. And yeah, it's a slower way to get to the place that you want to go. But by constantly doing that and taking good notes on yourself, I know you guys were talking about that in a recent episode, like when Brandon was in football, you end up figuring out exactly what you need from an athlete development standpoint. And I don't really coach anyone anymore, but that was a big part of what I would do. It was essentially like hypothesis testing on a week-to-week basis. Keep giving the athlete this same workout, minorly tweak the variables, and just let them progress week to week. And when they stall, think, why do I think they stalled? Whatever I hypothesize, give them a training to improve that thing, exhaust that progression, then pull the first thing back into the mix and see if they beat their performance from the last time they did it and take good notes. And I mean, a lot of it, ends up taking care of itself.
Well, I think a lot of people want to be given an answer, right? Like zone 2 is the answer to your endurance problems. But what you're getting at is that the answer is not like, it's not a thing. It's not just go do zone 2. It's a process. The answer to improving in anything is this process of essentially very controlled and regulated trial and error. Yeah. Right. Like you just said, you integrate some zone 2, add it on to train. That was another thing I think that was very clear. Asked in the questions of the first endurance podcast that we had over and over and over. Well, how should I do it? Should I take away these sessions? No, you cannot take away your sport specific work, right? It would be like, I always think about it like this. If you have like a basketball player and you're, okay, we need to improve your endurance for basketball. So we're going to have you stop playing basketball completely and you're going to do some zone 2 running. Do you think they'd get better at basketball?
Nope.
Probably not, right? You have to continue to play your sport or train your sport. And so I think that's a really good point that people need to be to keep in mind that it's a process that they need to add things and measure and retest and then decide, okay, was that the right thing for me to add, or do I need to make some adjustments to the way that I'm approaching this?
Yeah, and I feel like if you're thinking in these frameworks, like think about the limiter bridge performance models, essentially what you're talking about. So like understand what these different limiters are, how to spot them, how to use the limiter bridge performance model. One of the big things for me, because I was always that person, like looking up every new supplement training method thing, trying to figure out where they fit, this, that, the other thing. One, it's really stressful to do that, always trying to figure out the perfect thing. But when you understand these big picture concepts, it just dissolves all of the like anxiety and paralysis by analysis, because you realize like the training method isn't the thing. It doesn't really matter. Like there's no perfect method. It's more of the big picture and how things change over time.
Well, consistency. I mean, that's what I've found. I mean, if we boil all of this down, it's being consistent with something, choosing a route. Yeah. In my case, in that original podcast, I talked about using zone 2. I chose a route And I stuck to it and I was consistent with it for a long time. And I found that it improved my performance. And I think that's one of the problems that a lot of athletes run into is they're always looking for the next answer, the next thing. And they're not consistent with any one thing. Like they might try something for 2 weeks, like it's not working. Well, how do you know? It's 2 weeks. Like you shouldn't expect your body to adapt, especially if you have a longer training age in such a short span of time. I think that's a good
To me,
point.
I think it just seems like people need to fall into one of two camps. One camp is you just hire a coach, and that's the beauty of what you guys do for people. And I know you have a coach yourself. It's like, hey, even if you know some stuff, it's like give this to someone else who's going to think about it and have the plan and do what you said, maybe run some tests and keep you in good hands. Or you need to be okay with being the other person who's going to go down all these rabbit holes, try a whole bunch of things, and maybe not nail it all the time, but you're in the process of learning. And then maybe one day you end up knowing all this stuff. But it's like, you really got to pick a side and know which side you're on. Because if you're just, to your point, if you're not the person who's okay with, learning 1,000 things and maybe not nailing the mark, and you're not okay with it, then you're going to just be hating your life all the time because you're never going to be making progress.
Yeah. And I would say it's almost like, to maybe not have the best analogy for this, but like one route is like, work a government job. You know what you're going to be doing week after week, month after month. You know eventually you're going to have this salary this year, promotion, pension. It's a more predictable route, stable. You could kind of figure out where you're going to get, or you could work for a startup. Sheer chaos. Maybe it works out great. Maybe it doesn't work out at all. And I found in my experience over the past few years doing less coaching, I've consulted with a lot of coaches and their athletes where I'll like come into the program as a consultant. And what I found is the people that are like just the sheer innovators, sometimes they like really hit the mark and like, they really stumble into something that's like, wow, you're progressing fast. And then the other 70% of the time, they actually progress even slower than if they just followed a traditional methodical approach. But it's like it's almost like they're, start a startup company, fail, do another one. They failed 20 times. And then at the end of it, you're like, man, if you just like, took that stable job, you would have ended up in a better place.
TTT
so
compete.
The point is, I think as long as you were comfortable knowing that your innovation might never get you where you want to go,
that's
it's fine.
The point I was trying to make. It's like, if you're going to be in the startup route, you have to have the self-awareness to know that you're on that path and not be expecting government job.
Exactly.
Yeah, because that's where you're going to, as long as you have that awareness and that's the path you're on, then okay, party on, player. But otherwise,
I think you could even do an in-between too, but it's really hard. So that's where like one of the things that I used to ask athletes when I would first start working with them is like, how much risk tolerance do you have? Like, do you want me to throw some like kind of crazy stuff into your program just to see if it works? Like,
I'm going to need an example.
For example, like most things give most people an average response. Like you generally know for any given person, like, yeah, you'll give most people this protocol. They'll respond reasonably well. Some people might do fantastic. Some people might do terrible, but like the bulk of people are going to do fine. Then there's other protocols where
snort a line of explode off the bathroom sink.
Yeah, exactly. Like things like that. It's either going to work really well for you or it's not going to work at all. And there's no in between. So what I'll tell people is like, generally what I recommend is let's make like 80% of your training things that we know are going to work. You're not going to get any crazy stellar progress, but like we'll have you progressing. Then it's like, those are the things work. Then I'll give like 10% or things I think are going to work, where it's like, this might work well for you. You'll get a little faster progress than average or a little slower than average. Then there's the total guesses where I'm like, you know what? This is really a shot in the dark. I read this thing somewhere.
Yeah.
Let's try it. And there's a good chance that
What's the most surprised you've ever been with the 10% of the guesswork? I know it's putting you on the spot.
Some of this is like just some of the auto-regulated strength protocols, even ones that, okay, I'll give you a good example that when Kyle and I started experimenting with this, I was like, this is not going to work, is very low pressure BFR with very heavy weights. I was like, I can't think of a reason why this would work. You gave me the idea for it. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to give it to like 10 people and tell them that I don't know if it will be effective. And I'd say about half of them had really crazy strength gains when we tried it.
And their legs grew exponentially.
Grew significantly. And you're like, wow, that was really cool. And the other half of the people were like, I didn't feel anything. I feel weaker after doing it. And I'm like, it's not for you. So I think you could kind of blend those approaches, but as a coach, that's really hard to do. And as an athlete, a lot of people just aren't comfortable with that. People tend to often have extreme personalities where they want the predictability or they want to be like jumping all over the place. So I think it's like right coach, right athlete, not to...
Well, to that point, I think another one that surprised me that you came up with was the repeat desaturation, but not just... So a repeat desaturation structure could be something like every 90 seconds, you sprint for 15 seconds on an echo bike at 75% of your max wattage and do that for 10 sets. But what Evan did is
Gradual
took that and extended it out for people close to 45 minutes or to an hour. And there were people that were capable.
Did we film these before? I feel like I've filmed people do this.
I think so. And there were people that were capable of doing an hour holding over, and this was on an assault bike, not an echo bike, but holding over 1,000 watts for 15-second repeat intervals for over an hour, which you would never think that that was possible. But those people also turned out to be some of the best finishers in workouts like 19.1, the power snatch bar facing burpee.
I had a team female athlete. Her team had won the games a few times, had also gotten a podium. As an individual, she actually, I think, was ranked top 10 in the world in the Open. Just didn't want to compete as an individual. We got up to doing 90 minutes of repeat sprints where it would be like a 15-second sprint, rest a minute for 90 minutes.
Well, I think to that point, people should try that workout to have a dose of perspective, because being able to do a workout like that, like the reason that that's shocking to us that someone can sprint 15 seconds, which doesn't seem very long. I've tried to do it and I've never gotten more than like 7 or 8 sets of that. So 7 or 8 intervals of 15-second sprints and then, resting to the 90-second marker or something like that. So if that doesn't surprise you, go try that workout and then you'll see why we're surprised that someone can do that for 90 minutes.
Yeah, so things like that. And I mean, those were auto-regulated structures. So again, I would never think to give an athlete that, but we would have people, we would set up the workout so it would be self-limiting. So if that's what someone needed, they would end up there. So yeah, I mean, that was an example of something that we're like, there's no reason why I would ever think to do it. So just, make 10% of training, things like that. And I think over the years, I mean, that was a lot of the like really cool training protocols that we came up with ended up being those. But the difference between that and how people talk about zone 2 is those were never things that would work for people across the board. It would be like this specific subset of athletes, like we have these secret weapons that we could give them, but I would never go and tell, all the athletes on my roster to do something like that.
And would I be correct in guessing that even for the athletes that worked on it, wouldn't work forever?
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, we would phase it in and be like right time of year, right time of season. Oftentimes a lot of those things would be like off-season protocols. Then we would figure out ways to like transition them. So that repeat sprint protocol, if someone was getting closer to the season, we would maybe do like the 15-second sprint, rest a minute, then 10 thrusters as fast as possible, then rest a minute and like set it up that way.
There's going to be someone right now with a notebook writing that down, thinking that's going to be the thing that works for them. And for someone, it might, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we even tried like at times, I mean, Kyle and I have tried some like crazy stuff. Like for a while I was using a Spirit Tiger while biking on the Watt bike at TTT until I made myself black out doing that. So definitely don't do that. They actually warn you specifically not to do that. But like, I mean, we've experimented with a lot of things, some dumber than the other.
Well, so I guess here's a good question. So if you're like, hey, I'm doing these experiments, and obviously you have a specific retest in mind.
Yeah.
When you do it. So I guess something that would pop into my head to ask would be like, well, how would you be worried that the other training would be affecting it? How do you, or do you even care?
So that's a great question. And that's why I always recommend only change that thing. So you try and keep all other variables similar. And that's where like, at times, maybe the other things that you're doing in your training that you are keeping fixed ends up being like the perfect combination of things that you combine it with. So you might try that experiment again at a different time of year when the rest of your training is set up differently, and you might not get the same result. That's also something that if you are taking these notes, you could learn.
Yeah.
So like over time, I mean, I would have like pages and pages of notes on
that's what
athletes.
I was going to say. It sounds like the key is you got to keep up with it.
I would almost create like decision trees and cookbooks for them. So I'm like, this specific athlete needs to improve strength, and this is the other thing they're doing in their training. Then you go like down this path, the decision tree, and that's how we would select protocols.
I was always a little different than that because I was just concerned with like the end performance. So rather than being as detailed and really trying to like, okay, I just changed this one variable. I mean, I would change more than one variable, but based on experience, because in the end, all I really cared about, like, is, am I getting this person moving in the direction that we want to go?
So that is what I had to do to try and replicate the way that you program. So I'm not just saying this, like, your style of programming is actually what I was trying to replicate. It's always like, out of all the TTT coaches, and I think everyone does a great job, yours was always the most similar to how I think, but I feel like you always had a way more intuitive like structure to it. Like, I would tell you these like ideas that I had, and then I would see your programming and I'm like, damn, Kyle implemented that in a way more logical way than I did. So yeah, I mean, I had to do that in order to like make these things work, because I am less intuitive with how I would program. But looking at your programs, I mean, I think you were fundamentally doing the same things, just you didn't need to create decision trees for it.
It's because I was in my garage just messing around. You tell me something and I'd be like, I'm gonna go try it.
Yeah, but also he had the benefit of hanging out with you, someone who is making the decision trees. So, hey, we're running short on time here. We got this space rented out. We might do another one tomorrow. But in the last little 10 minutes here, on the way here from the airport, we were talking about different things. And one of the things you said in the car that kind of made my light go off was, you said that there's a test that people could do that you could probably guess their capacity.
Yes.
What was that?
Right. So to give some context, so yeah, the NNOXX device measures muscle oxygenation, nitric oxide levels. So let's say the three of us, we put this device on our forearm and we take a BFR cuff and pump it up until we create an arterial occlusion. So if you had a pulse oximeter on your finger, 0 pulse, completely occlude the artery. So when that happens, we're just hanging out here and your tissues are going to start utilizing oxygen, and we'll start releasing nitric oxide from your red blood cells. We take each of our number at the end before we release the cuff. Chris's nitric oxide is 95 is his total level. Kyle's is 1,000,000. I'm 14. That's our rank order of how well we do. So we could predict with about 95% accuracy what someone's performance will be just sitting here at rest inflating the cuff.
What do you mean by their performance? Like, who would win the CrossFit Games?
No, so that, like, it would have to be relevant. So that, I mean, a single arm test like that would be, who has the best grip capacity? We, did that device on our quadricep. We cut off blood flow on one leg. We could say who is the best, like...
so if we were having a contest, who could hang on a pull-up bar the longest, that would have told us
or
probably.
Like if, we were doing like some kind of grip trial to fatigue. But if we want to make this, like, what do people actually care about? Like, CrossFitters aren't like, oh, let's just like squeeze a stress ball as many times as we can.
Give us something cool.
So put a cuff on both legs, put a device on each quad, pump up the cuffs, cut off blood flow to both legs, and get total nitric oxide release between each leg. With about 85% accuracy, we could figure out who would do the best on an assault bike test. 10-minute max cals, or like a ramp test, seeing who could get the highest wattage and things like that. So it's cool because...
And how is that doing that? How is it, like, what?
Because your maximal...
Or what is the device measuring?
So it's measuring the amount of oxygen in your muscles and the amount of nitric oxide that you release from red blood cells. So what we get at the end of that test is who could utilize the most oxygen in their muscles, really good predictor of performance, who could release the most nitric oxide, get the most blood flow and oxygen delivery. That's like 2/3 of what accounts for your VO2 max.
Yeah.
So what's cool about that is you can't game the test. A lot of times, like, people talk about, McNamara's fallacy, like, if you train for a test, it defeats the point of the test. Well, that's something you can't train for. You're sitting here at rest, and it's non-invasive in that we don't need to ruin your training, have you go like crush yourself on the floor. We could get a pretty good proxy of who's going to be the fittest, or, just do that test yourself in training. And you don't...
I got a business idea for you guys. Let's go get those monitors, put them on people, and then get the info, and then go make bets with other people about who's going to win.
Perfect.
Yeah, I knew you were going
there.
We're
going to be millionaires, boys. Why is measuring the what is it?
Nitric oxide.
Nitric oxide. I keep messing it up with what's the other one that makes you
nitrous?
High? Yeah,
nitrous oxide.
Yeah, okay. Why is that important to know? Like, why is that? Okay, your little device figured it out.
Yeah.
But why do y'all care about that?
So nitric oxide controls blood flow and oxygen delivery to brain, heart, and muscles. You don't have nitric oxide, you don't have blood flow and oxygen delivery. So the higher your nitric oxide, better your fitness, better your health, better your performance. That would really be the simplest way to think about it.
And when did y'all figure this out?
When?
Yeah.
We've been working on this for about 3 years, and it took us about 2 years to really get the technology perfected. And for the past year, we've been working on making it easy to use for people.
We're actually in the car. One of the things I was asking you was, I asked you, what was the coolest thing you've learned? Because we haven't seen you. You haven't been in Atlanta for a while. So what was one of the coolest things that's happened or you've discovered within the last little time? And you said,
oh God, what did I say?
You said there was a day where it was like it all came. Like,
oh yeah.
That y'all figured out
Finished
how
the
to
product.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of false starts here. So yeah, we were spending a lot of time, one person to collect data, send it to the other person to process it.
Well, I don't even think on this podcast we've said that you were trying to make this thing. So
yeah. So yeah.
What is the thing that y'all discovered?
Yeah, that we could measure nitric oxide release from red blood cells non-invasively and in real time, which had never been done before. People have been trying to do this for decades. So
isn't it crazy that this little dude who was just at our office is just, okay, now he's off in Rhode Island just figuring out how to get this working.
Nitric oxide.
Like, how cool is that? All right, I guess we're all tired out now because we can't form any sentences. But hopefully tomorrow we'll film another one. Maybe I can get on IG and see what questions people have, or we'll come up with our own little subject. So you have a Substack now, right?
Yes.
So who do you recommend read that, and where could they find it?
Yes, I have 2 Substacks. One of them is on human performance on Substack. That's for anyone that's interested in the science of training, physiology, all the things that we've been talking about. This one. Second Substack called Decoding Biology. That's all about teaching people how to build machine learning systems for biomedical applications. I don't know.
I subscribe to both, and the machine learning one is way over my head.
Yeah, so if you don't already know how to code, probably not much in there, but maybe
Do you know
find
how to code?
Yeah. So I actually build machine learning systems.
Gosh dang. When did you do that? When did you learn that?
So about a year ago, I went back to school and spent some time studying data science and machine learning.
I wish we had more time to dive. Maybe that's what we'll do next time. But so those 2 Substacks, do you still bother with any other social medias you want people to follow? What's the, what was the device, NNOXX?
Yeah.
Do they have their?
Yes. So it's NNOXX, so NNOXX _INC.
And what is your role in that? You're
I'm a co-founder and the lead physiologist.
Nice. That sounds elite or legit.
It does.
Kyle, you have any? No one cares.
Yeah.
No one wants to follow
Don't
Kyle.
follow me.
Knows where.
All right.
Don't follow me.
We'll see you next time.